What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and if you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell because we cover everything Toronto Maple Leafs, and trust me, you do not want to miss what we are about to get into today because this is one of those stories that genuinely stopped me in my tracks this morning. We are talking about a name that has been floating around the hockey world for months now, a name that carries both enormous excitement and enormous risk, and we are talking about the possibility, the very real, very alive possibility, of Patrik Laine suiting up in blue and white for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, before you click away and say you've heard it before, hold on, because the story has a lot more layers to it than you might think, and the connection to new head coach Jim HILLER makes this whole situation genuinely fascinating. So grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, and let's break this thing down from top to bottom. Let's set the stage first, because context is everything here. The Toronto Maple Leafs had one of the most painful seasons in recent memory. A team that many expected to be competing deep in the playoffs finished 32 wins, 36 losses, and 14 overtime losses. They finished dead last in the Atlantic Division and 15th in the Eastern Conference. That is not just a bad season. That is a franchise alarm going off at full volume. The goal differential was -46. -46. That is not a playoff team. That is not even close to a playoff team. So when the offseason arrived, everything was on the table, and the Maple Leafs made clear they were willing to blow things up and rebuild the identity of this franchise from the ground up. Out went general manager Brad Treliving, who had been fired in March. In came John Chayka, a bold and analytically minded executive who made a name for himself with the Arizona Coyotes. Alongside him, in one of the most jaw-dropping hires you will ever see in professional hockey, the Maple Leafs brought in Matt Sundin, yes, the Matt Sundin, as a senior executive advisor of hockey operations. Then Craig Berube, who had only been behind the bench for 2 seasons, was dismissed. And then came the hire that ties directly into this Laine conversation, and that is the appointment of Jim HILLER as the 41st head coach in Toronto Maple Leafs franchise history. Now let's talk about Jim HILLER for a second because this is important, and it is something a lot of people are glossing over when they discuss the Laine situation. HILLER is a 57-year-old coach from Port Alberni, British Columbia, and this is actually his second time working with the Maple Leafs. He spent 4 seasons from 2015 to 2019 as an assistant coach under Mike Babcock, and during that time, he was specifically in charge of the power play. Read that again, Jim HILLER ran the power play in Toronto. He worked directly with a young Austin Matthews. He built relationships with skilled offensive players. He understands what it takes to get elite offensive talent performing at its best. And now he is back as the head man. His time with the Los Angeles Kings as head coach gave him a 93-58-24 record. The Kings were known as a defensive team, a hard-to-play-against checking machine, and HILLER has been honest about the fact that he wants to find more offensive balance in Toronto. He literally stood up at his introductory press conference and said the phrase "celebrate offense again." Celebrate offense again. That is your new head coach in Toronto saying openly that he wants to get back to playing an exciting, attacking brand of hockey. And when you hear that, and then you hear that the team is linked to Patrik Laine, a man who at his best is one of the most lethal pure snipers the game has ever seen, you start to understand why this connection makes a certain kind of beautiful, terrifying sense. So let's get into the actual Laine situation. According to Montreal Gazette reporter Herb Zurkowski, since free agency opened on July 1st, Patrik Laine has been linked to the New York Rangers, the Minnesota Wild, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and more recently the Philadelphia Flyers. 5 teams. That is a significant number for a player of Laine's caliber, even accounting for his injury history. And Zurkowski made a very interesting note specifically about the Toronto connection, writing that signing with the Maple Leafs would potentially put Laine on a line with Captain Austin Matthews, who was selected first overall in 2016, 1 pick ahead of Laine. And that right there is where the story gets genuinely electric. Think about what that means for a moment. Matthews and Laine. Pick 1 and pick 2 from the same draft class, both in their prime, or at least both potentially back in their prime, suiting up together on the same team. That storyline alone would sell out Scotiabank Arena for the next 3 years. But this is not just a marketing dream because when Laine is healthy, when he is right, he is a generational shooting talent. This is a man who scored 44 goals in 2017 and 2018 with the Winnipeg Jets. He scored 20 goals in 52 games in the 2024 to 2025 season when his body was cooperating. At 6 feet 4 inches, 208 pounds, with one of the most natural shots in hockey history, Patrik Laine on a power play is a different kind of problem for opposing penalty killers. And you already know that Jim HILLER, as a man who ran a power play and who wants to celebrate offense again, has to be at least a little intrigued by what Laine could bring to that second unit. But here is where we have to be real with you because no Leafs conversation ever gets to be simple, does it? There are real complications to making this happen, and they are not small ones. First and most obviously, Toronto is already over the cap. According to Puckpedia's team cap tracker, the Maple Leafs are sitting at a projected cap hit of roughly $106.75 million against a 2026 to 2027 ceiling of approximately $104 million. So they are already about $2.75 million in the red before they add anyone. That is a problem. Now the reason there is still a conversation happening at all is because of a very specific NHL rule. Because Laine logged more than 400 NHL games and spent significant time on injured reserve, more than 100 days, he qualifies for a one-year, performance bonus-heavy contract structure. Think of it like an entry-level deal in terms of the base salary, with the big numbers tied to performance incentives. The base hits the cap immediately, but the bonuses only count if a team's total bonuses exceed 7.5% of the league ceiling, and anything beyond that rolls into the following season's number. That flexibility is crucial for a team like Toronto. Laine is projected by AFP Analytics to land a deal worth around $850,000 as a base. That is a dramatically different number than his old $8.7 million annual average value deal. The market for him has dropped significantly because of injury concerns, and that ironically makes him a far more viable option for a cap-strapped team. And there is another layer here that confirms this is not just idle speculation. NHL insider Elliotte Friedman reported back in March that there were actual discussions about Patrik Laine potentially ending up in either Philadelphia or Toronto before the 2026 trade deadline. Those talks did not result in anything at the time. Laine was dealing with that brutal core muscle surgery that limited him to just 5 games with the Montreal Canadiens last season, 5 games, 1 assist and barely 12.5 minutes of ice time across the entire year. There was also the matter of a $2 million signing bonus that was due in March, which likely made him a more expensive proposition for teams at that time. And his 10-team no-trade list further complicated any potential deal. So the pieces did not come together at the deadline. But he is now a free agent. No trade required. No picks or prospects exchanged. No retained salary complications. Just a conversation between Laine and the Maple Leafs about whether they can find a number that works for both sides. Now let's talk about what this would actually look like on the ice, because that is what matters most. Jim HILLER is inheriting a Maple Leafs team that desperately needs scoring help. The -46 goal differential does not lie. John Chayka has already been aggressive in reshaping this roster. They traded goaltender Joseph Woll and defenseman Simon Benoit to the Philadelphia Flyers for goaltender Samuel Ersson, defenseman Emile Andre, and a third-round pick. They have been adding pieces to the bottom 6. They hold the number 1 overall pick in the 2026 draft and selected a franchise-altering talent. But the forward group still needs offensive punch from somewhere beyond Austin Matthews and his usual line mates, and that is exactly where Laine could fit. You would not need Patrik Laine to be the guy. You would not need him to log 20-plus minutes a night. What you need from Laine in this situation is exactly what his body can realistically give right now. Offensive zone starts, power play time, maybe 10 to 14 minutes a game on a line where he can get clean looks at the net and use that legendary shot. Stick him on the right side of Matthews for a few shifts a game and see what happens. The defensive responsibility does not have to be enormous. His role on the power play, however, could be transformative. A healthy Laine on that man advantage, paired with the quarterback ability Matthews brings, is a nightmare scenario for penalty killers across the league. The question fans are really asking, though, and this came up all over social media and in comment sections around the hockey world, is, who has to leave to make room for Laine? The Maple Leafs roster is already pretty full. Names like Jack Roslovic, Easton Cowan, Nick Paul, and Colton Sissons are all part of that forward group. Somebody has to move if Laine is coming in, and that is either a trade or a buyout conversation that Chayka will have to navigate carefully. The Morgan Riley situation has also been swirling all off-season, with trade rumors that have largely gone quiet, but if that move happens and clears cap space, suddenly the math gets a lot more workable